Kia ora everybody, welcome. Just to let you know quickly, in the room with me here today, I have Patrick Jones, obviously, Bruce Whitford, Ryan Hollis, we've got Jonathan Cook, Martin Carroll, Yong Nero, Suri Tanai, and Chris Part. So if you're wondering who's in the room with me, that's who we are. Welcome to this presentation on the Unified Funding System. I'd like to invite Martin to open us, please, with a karakia.
Sure, e tu whana. Me karakia timatanga tātou. Kia tūturu tātou, kia manaaki tātou. Kia whaiheranga tātou, kia tū hono tātou. Whano, haramata toki, haumi e hui e, tāi. E noho. No mai haere mai, Patrick, tēnā koe hōmā, haere mai ki te whare takioro Manukau te Pukenga, kia ora kia koe mō tēnei kōrero I tēnei rā. No mai haere mai hoki ki te whānau, just welcoming Patrick. Patrick's one of us, has been here before. And we're aware that you're not bringing all the answers today, and you're not responsible for the unified funding system. We're just keen to know whatever it is that you can share with us, and keen to contribute thoughts about how it might impact us on the ground. So looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Kia ora Martin. Kia kuranga kia kua hui mai nei, whakatanaki I ngā kūpapo te wā, tēnā koutou katoa. A privilege to be amongst colleagues today in the room here and online. Thank you for the very warm welcome and the setup, and my apologies I couldn't be with you a few weeks ago, but I understand my colleagues were. But it was a pleasure to take the opportunity to get back up here and spend some time. This is one of probably, despite I'm sure you've got lots of challenging questions for me, I always find these things far more positive and enjoyable parts of my role compared to many endless hours sitting in front of the computer on emails and spreadsheets and things like that. Little bit about myself. I don't know if you sent out the bio that I wrote for this symposium, but I've been with Te Pukenga for almost 2 years now, seconded to that role of Director Portfolio and Performance, seconded from my role as an Executive Director at the Eastern Institute of Technology, EIT, in Napier, where I'm based and live. Have been with EIT for about 15 years or so, and in that role at EIT I've covered lots of stuff, lots of operational stuff. Our Chief Executive, Chris, is a fan of sharing stuff around and not necessarily keeping it to certain lines. So it's been an experience to have lots of multiple facets to my role. But primarily I've always been involved around the investment planning and been responsible for that investment planning function and strategy of the organisation. And we've had some pretty cool experiences at EIT over that 15 years or so. And then was given the opportunity to be seconded into the Academic Delivery and Innovation team. And as I say, that's coming up 2 years. So I'm a veteran, I suppose, of Te Pukenga. There wouldn't be, when I started, there wasn't that much around. And I met Dr. Angela Beaton, I remember about 2 years ago, and we had a discussion and have been working together. I've been working in her team since. I think one of the important things to note is that I have maintained a very small portion of whilst I'm seconded to Te Pukenga, I have maintained a very small portion of responsibilities, I suppose, back at EIT, and that was at the prompting of my chief executive there, Chris Collins, and both because he wanted me around to be able to, chew the fat at times, but also in his mind, from his own experience, he thought needed to keep keep myself grounded. At the very least, being allowed to keep my office on campus and come along to the free morning teas or something. But it's been a really positive experience, and one I'm grateful for his guidance on, because it has given me quite a, and I've said this to Te Puke colleagues, and I say it all the time, it gives me quite a unique view of what's happened in the last couple of years. And whilst today I'll talk about the UFS, I don't mind giving insights into other things that I've seen happen. And you know, being on the ground and being sometimes in the head office in Hamilton and seeing, with all the best intent in the world and genuine desire and professionalism, seeing what that happens and what it lands, and trying to figure out how sometimes it doesn't do that. So, and sometimes it does, and increasingly I hope it does. So that's a bit about me. So I'm going to just run through some slides that I've put together around the unified funding system. I'll freak you out. So there's about 20 slides, but don't get freaked out. We can just run through them. Some of them are a bit text heavy, but I really want to get to the end so we can have just a Q&A, really. So if you've got questions as we go along, you can put them in the chat, and then I assume we can pick them up at the end. So there's a little bit of what we'll cover off today. So I talked a little bit about myself and my background there. Those are the questions that you sent me through, I think, for the symposium. So very shortly after receiving those, I got sick and couldn't come, and there was no indication of the challenge of those questions. But that's what I've tried to theme a little bit of today's discussion around.
Sorry, we're just having a little bit of a technical issue getting the slides up. So we're just
I can pause.
we're sharing those. No.
So you can see them now? Thumbs up, yeah. Excellent. So, just as I was saying, there's a little bit of an overview. Those are the questions that I've tried that I think you framed up as part of your symposium, that I've tried to frame up some of today's discussion around. I'll give you, as Martin said, I'll give you some insights into some of it, but I won't be able to answer everything there. But I can certainly give you insights. A little bit of an introduction to the unified funding system. I'm never quite sure where everyone's at on that sort of their understanding, so I'm just going to start sort of a little bit from scratch and say that, remember, the unified funding system is just one part of ROVE, and I listed those 8 things there. You don't have to read through them, but you can kind of, when you look at those things, look at all those moving parts. We've got WDC standing up, finding themselves at the moment. So that's an interesting and dynamic space. You've got the regional skills leadership groups doing the same thing. Taumata Aronui stood up. We've got Te Pukenga, that's us, standing up, finding ourselves, finding our way forward. Got this. So those were those structural things, if you like. Then obviously one of the key parts of ROVE, and we'll talk about this, is that big emphasis on shifting the role of supporting workplace learning from ITOs, but actually into providers. So that was a massive transition for those ITOs. As big as a transition as it is for us, and when I say us, sorry, for me as an ITP person with that background, my colleagues and ITOs are similarly experiencing those transitions to go from ITOs to TITOs into WBL, and then shortly WBL to dissolve, and us being, from the 1st of January next year, one organisation. Centres of Vocational Excellence, I don't know if we will cover off too much or need to about those, but probably Martin and myself could cover any specific questions on those. They were a part of the reforms that were just sort of out there. I think they were already in train, and they're there and they're doing a good job for us. I'm not sure if we'll see more of them, I'm really not. But then that seventh one, which is why I'm here, okay, we have to unify the funding system to achieve some of those other things. And then, of course, there's other reforms, and that speaks to actually kind of going to need NZQA to adjust things as well. So the point of this slide is to say, hey, well, I'm going to talk about the unified funding system. It's to achieve these reforms requires all of those things to progress and deliver on their specific outcomes. But let's get into the UFS. So the Unified Funding System, in summary, again, just starting with the basics, it replaces the Student Achievement Component, or SAC, and the Industry Training Fund at levels 3 to 7 non-degree. And I know we can talk about this later. I know someone will ask straight away, what about that? You know, maybe we should shift stuff into this level 7 space, etc. We can talk about that soon. But that's what it does. It replaces those funds to creates a new unified funding system, which it obviously had to do to bring together that ITP and ITO delivery, delivery and organisation. The unified funding system is made up of 3 components. So the first component is delivery, which we're quite used to, being funded for an EFT or an STM, and that's 84% of the fund. And then what they did was they created 2 parts of the funding system called the strategic component and the learner component, both of which are have 8% of the funding. And the point behind those 2 things was, I guess, to deliver funding that was not bound to, or to give funding to a provider that was not bound to delivery. And if you've been around long enough, you know how difficult it was always been to do anything innovative or grow or deliver initiatives when essentially all your entire revenue stream was based off delivery, what you could enrol. So you would forever be making cases that I could pull this off if I can enrol this number of people, or finding other revenue streams like international, and that's not a space I particularly want to get into today. But those funds are designed to do that they're not bound to delivery. And so they are bound to outcomes and milestones and all of that, but they're not bound to delivery. And we can talk about those a little bit of detail soon. And then for the delivery component, and this is where the UFS gets quite complex and where I get most of the questions in these sorts of sessions, is around the 5 modes that it introduces. So we had the delivery component being 84%, but of course they've broken it out into 5 modes. And I think we all probably get the first 2, or probably 3 of the 5. So provider-based, we understand. It's what many of us in the polytechnic space are quite used to. I've, for years, right through the reforms, and Martin and I were just talking about some of the workshops we were in the reforms, even before NZIST and Te Pukenga were even in existence, and really challenging that concept of polytechs just do classroom-based learning. So when I talk, you can know that I understand provider-based delivery to be dynamic and exciting and flexible and highly, at times, with high components of in-work learning. I understand that it gets lumped into this TEC definition of provider-based. So we'll continue to challenge it, or to challenge that narrative when we do hear it, that that it's just classroom-based. I don't like that. Then we have provider-based extramural, which I think is pretty clear what that is. Work-based pathway to work is an interesting mode that I'm still wrapping my head around, and I'm still, honest, not entirely sure how TEC will work out how to fund that. They have given us indications, which we can touch on. Work-based, for all intents and purposes, I think you could have just called that apprenticeships, because it's the same definition. So what we've had, as people have grappled with the UFS, and I certainly know my colleagues at EIT have said, oh, great, my program's work-based. I'll get that funding, and I'll go, no, you won't, because it's not work-based according to that specific definition, needing that tripartite agreement between employer, learner and provider. So essentially looking like an apprenticeship. So that's where that sort of feeling comes from at times, saying, oh, what? So provider-based doesn't really describe me, but this is just a mechanism for funding. So, and then assessment and verification is something that I've had conversations, I've been privy to conversations with work-based learning colleagues on, and they probably do more of that than I'm familiar with in the ITP sector, but they are looking closely at that. So that's just a bit of a summary of the UFS. I put the rates there. I don't know why I put the rates there, because you've probably all done the analysis to say, oh, okay, my program was this and that's that funding rate, and now it's in this F1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or something, and at that mode, this is how much I get. But I put it there so that you can kind of see how TEC have laid it out. This is, if I'm honest, this is how technically our systems will start to monitor and measure things. So I know, for example, I know Jonathan and I will be doing work. I've just done some at EIT to say, right, start switching the consumption of funding from the old modes to these sorts of modes. Whether you like it or not, those are the sorts of things we have to do. What stands out there is obviously our extramural is a flat rate, regardless of the type of category. And actually at the outset, I should have said that these rates are actually not, I couldn't find anything in any of the papers that showed that these rates were based on the cost of delivery or the cost of service. So they don't, in my mind, necessarily represent that. I don't know how they were come up with, but I don't think they didn't take into account how much it costs. Those are the rates. The work-based rates are there and the provider-based rates are there. There's a funny thing happening in that you've still got work-based people looking at it and going, oh, the provider rate-based is still better. I wonder how much of my work-based program I can get into provider-based. I don't know if that's necessarily a smart thing, but that's a question people start to say. This is driven quite clearly, and I'll show it on the next slide, at pulling the funding lever to drive the system, and we are part of that system, towards a certain outcome that Rove wanted, which was, as we mentioned at the outset, an increase in work-based delivery. I think the bottom one's quite important to note, F6 Te Reo Māori and Tikanga Māori, that they've kept those rates the same. I think, I don't know for sure, but the background to that would be that a reduction in those rates probably would have exposed them to quite a significant risk in terms of being in terms of treaty partnership, I would have thought. So they've kept them there, and in fact, that is a big one of the big TEC priorities, is to grow delivery in that space as well. An interesting observation just on that bottom one is the place like where I am from, EIT. That's one of our biggest faculties. So there's over 600, close to 700 EFTs that would fall into that category. And so as a standalone division within Te Pūkenga, it's actually had less of an impact from the UFS than others because of such large numbers in that, which has been an interesting observation. Not that it makes a difference for the whole pot, I think. So there's a little bit about rates there. As I said, so that was about delivery component. This one's about the learner component, as I said, and I'll show you the actual total numbers of dollars that Te Pūkenga is getting shortly. The learner component, I've just copied some notes there from what TEC said it was designed for. The table at the bottom is how they will calculate it. So for Te Pūkenga, what they do, and for all providers, is that they do a calculation of your cohort of learners, I think, from the latest data they've got. So it's probably a 2-year lag. So for Te Pukenga, it was the 2021 data. And they went through it and they looked at all of those things there, and they worked out how much money that would entitle us to. And then I'd imagine they'll do types of wash-ups, at the end of the year based on your cohort. They'll do a wash-up of whether they owe you more or you owe them more. Or I don't think they'll actually they may not do a wash-up. They may just say, here's the amount we gave you, and we'll just always have a 2-year lag. One of the questions I often get about that is that, okay, can you tell me who those learners are, so then I can make sure that learner gets that amount of dollars to them? And that's not necessarily how it's designed to work. It comes to us as a lump sum, and then we'll go through a process of what initiatives, network-wide initiatives, and they could be localised as well, but what initiatives they're for. So in case you're wondering, does each student get that the answer is no. The strategic component here, as I said earlier, is non-volume based, so it's not based on delivery, again about 88%. And it particularly seeks to support the regional national skills priorities. And so for Te Pukenga, split into both supporting regional national skills priorities, but also supporting program development and maintenance. And the table at the bottom there shows the total that TEC have put in. So by far, Te Pukenga got the lion's share of this. So 70% of this regional skills priorities, so 26.6 million has come to Te Pukenga, 11.4 to PTEs, the Wānanga Nunn, and then on the program development and maintenance side, again 60% to Te Pukenga. And actually that for Te Pukenga, that is split, that 60% or 22.8 is split again. There's a certain proportion. It's not dictated, but roughly I think TC have been saying about half of that should go to your OF, your online fully distance learning development as well. So that's the amount of money there. And the next slide, sorry, there's just a few notes there, I guess, on that strategic component. It's really important, and we've just come off the back of completing, and it's in front of Council for approval and TEC for funding, the investment plan for 2023 to 2025, which lots of people will have been familiar with over the years, as each Polytech had to produce one. Lots of people might be relieved that they haven't had to do one for the last few years, but Te Pukenga is on its third one, and this is part of my key part of my role. So we've just sent that off to Council for approval, and it was really critical in that plan, and this is, and TEC have been really strong in their advice to us that we must show how we're responding to those, how we're utilising the funding to respond to those things that are listed there, and importantly, taking advice from WDCs. And that we're not simply just using it, and this is often, this is one of the first views that people said, oh, well, we've gone down and sat funding, so you can just take the strategic component and put it over there and everything will be honky-dory. No, that wouldn't have gone down well. Not to say that you can't use some of the funding to contribute to what you might call more marginal, to supporting more marginal delivery or more rural or remote delivery where we know our costs are higher, but certainly not just as a lump sum. I will just put it here to offset that. So what we're focused on is obviously those initiatives that collectively are most likely to drive transformation and, if I'm honest, financial viability as well. One of the things that and debates and challenges and toing and froing as we've wrestled with this investment plan and how to tag these strategic and learner components to is that if you went and invested in all brand new things, you'd probably just increase your cost base and just make our financial situation worse. And so you've got to find that balance between new initiatives that will drive us forward on the outcomes of what we seek to achieve, versus things that are existing in our network that are well worth investing in and scaling up, etc., rather than just buying bright new shiny stuff. It'd be a bit like your house, right? Got a windfall of money and you went and just blew it all on something new and it was great, but actually over here, you haven't really dealt with some of the other, and when I say deal with, you haven't really looked at what you might have been able to invest in to stand up or make better something that you already had. So that's been quite a challenge. I can't share with you today a list of things that this is what we're going to invest in and what we're not. It's in the investment plan, which has gone to council, TC, and I think has probably gone to our transitional leagues. I'm not sure, Martin, but I know Gus had asked for it, and we certainly had no problem sharing it in draft, subject to council approval. It might just be sitting with the transitional leads, CEs. I'm not even sure what we call them as a group anymore. So we'll be able to share it shortly. So how do you bring all that together? So some of our work so far has been about, I've got a whole lot of questions for TC, there'll be a whole lot of reporting people and enrolment people that'll be saying, how do we do, implement this into systems, etc. How do we report it to TC? There's a whole lot of work going on with TC about that. All I'll say is that TC have introduced a unified funding system without a unified reporting system, and that's something they need to sort out. What we have done though is model a whole lot of, what we did was we modelled the UFS as if it was applied to 2021 actual delivery, just to give you an insight, and that's what this slide does here. So at the top so this is what we did in 2021 as a group of polytechnics, and at the time when this was done a few months ago, the TITOs that were with Te Pūkenga all coming in. And at the time, in 2021, you could see that we, as a network, Polytechnics got $502 million. That's at the top there, to deliver that $53,000 Fs. And that was in that SAC level 3+. And down the bottom, ITOs got about 100, or those ITOs got about 178 million. And if you took, what we did is we took the UFS rates in that and said, right, just apply them to, and TEC did this as well, just apply them to that 2021 delivery mix and show us what it does. And that's what the columns on the right there do. So you can see there that if you like, that provider base, those our previous ITP subsidiaries, that shift of those funding rates that I showed you earlier took that 502 million of SAC 3+ down to 426 million of UFS. I called it 7+ there. So that's degree and above, and then UFS levels 3 to 7. So all of us probably noticed that straight away with our ITP subsidiary hat on. We would have probably modelled it ourselves and said, oh, we're going to lose X million dollars. And as I say, we had already modelled it. We'd modelled it for each subsidiary, some subsidiaries less or more. But that's what it did as a collective. But then you keep going down and you see what happens in our TITO, in our work-based learning space, where their 178 million that they would have been funded to deliver those STMs in 2021, they delivered that same number, there or thereabouts, in 2023. It's about 312 million. So you get an uplift there. And in fact, you get more of an uplift than you did in a downshift from the ITPs. And so that's what happened. That's what it looks like collectively. So at the bottom line there, what's really, and this was to show something else actually. This was to show that there was a view that the strategic component and the learner component, which I've put at the bottom there, which together are about 100 million, were just top sliced off other things. And the point about this was that they weren't actually, it's additional money that's come in. So if we were to deliver next year exactly the same or very close to the same delivery as we did in 2021, and we achieve those milestones that we need to for strategic and learner component, it's about $120 million more in the pot. And that was great months and months ago, where everyone thought, that's great. And then you saw the budget, and that budget that we've got has all of this into account, so we still have an issue. So I still, as a personal view, I still think that regardless of how it's been broken up, it's still not enough, right? So, regardless of how TC have created this unified funding system and the rates and the pots that they've put it in, the fundamental thing here, is it enough? And you can probably all draw your own conclusions there. So like for like, as I said, we would have, if we did the same next year as last year, about $127 million extra. So it is an opportunity and a positive impact for Te Pūkenga, and it is more funding than we've had, even though I might say it's still not enough, but it is more than we've had. And I think the thing about the strategic and learner components to remember there is they're not one-offs. You're going to get those each year. So if we are, and in fact, if I just go back, remember the strategic component might stay the same, but the learner component, based on the learners that are used to calculate that, if we continue to do a great job with them and even do a better job, and our population is heading that way anyway, then there's no reason to think that fund won't keep growing. So to get about $100 million each year is something that we need to keep in mind, that it's not a one-off. So getting that each year, I would hope success builds on success. In fact, it might become difficult to spend it all at a point if it has to be on initiatives. So that's a conversation with TEC. As I said, that the strategic and learner components make up about 75% of that increase, and TEC are very keen to make sure that they're appropriately tagged to agreed initiatives with TEC and milestones and progress reported. And that bottom table there was really one that I just put as an observation that that shows what the UFS did in terms of what I call largely balancing out the rates. And you could argue that why did they need to balance it out when the cost structures are so different? But that's kind of what it's done. Before the UFS, the average rate for a set, for an ITP and an ITO, and then after. This is our actual numbers for next year. So this is what we've been given. This is what's in the investment plan. It'll come out soon. So you can see that the table on the right is all the different funds that we get, and I've just highlighted the top one there, which is the UFS, level 3 to 7. So we're getting given $546.6 million from TEC, or that was their indicative allocation. And those are indicative allocations of all the other funds as well. And as we gathered up your MOPs, those are the mixed provisions, those are the templates that people like Jonathan and others send in that say this is how many Fs we'll do in each of those categories. As we've collated those, they are generally in line with the indicative funding that we've been given. So much so that of that total 882 million at the bottom that TEC have said this is what we think you need next year, that's largely what we'll be requesting. We won't be requesting more, and hopefully we won't be not forecasting to necessarily give any back. There'll be ups and downs throughout the year, but the point about that is that put the UFS aside, our mix of provision is showing a certain direction for next year that is at this stage in line with the funding that we're going to be given. So it hasn't shortchanged us in any way. We've got the funding. Our issue will be on our ability to one, meet it, and then meet it in a viable way. The split of the funding is interesting though, because they lump that 546 million of UFS all together, but they don't at this stage. They only at this stage require us to split it into two modes: work-based and provider-based. They haven't required us to split it into the 5 different modes. And
Sorry, just so I'm
Yeah.
clear, we're missing zeros there, aren't we? 250 million and 200.
No, I'll talk about that in a moment. We're not. They haven't required us to put that UFS into those 5 different modes, and there's still they've said that they won't monitor us or measure us in those 5 different buckets. I want that. I'm quite keen to get that in writing because I believe it when I see it. That my experience with TC is that they've tended to want to put everything into lots of buckets and then apply lots of rules around those buckets and making it hard to move within those buckets. We've said that would stifle the UFS. That would stifle us if we can't easily just go, oh, we've done more of that and less of that, more of that, less of that. If they say no, you'll have to go through a process to move some from this, work-based to provider-based or assessment and verification, etc. I'm sure they'll take an interest in it, but we don't want them to necessarily put conditions around each bucket. The point there, Martin, about that split of the UFS, though. So next year, that 546.6 million is actually, it's almost 50-50. So 48% of that is in the work-based modes, and the rest in provider-based, and is actually from the indicative allocation that TEC gave us when they split out that 546, is that we've actually shifted 29 million more. Well, we haven't shifted it, that's just what the mixes show. 29 million more going over there, and there was about 24 million less being needed in provider-based. It's a reflection of what's happened this year, where in this year we're in the non-UFS, so we've got SAC level 3+. This year we were given 522 million of SAC level 3+, and I think we're going to, this is all ITP subsidiaries, we're going to land around 486. So we would be, in any other year, giving that back to TEC around about 20-something million. But our WBL colleagues have actually over-delivered this year by about 25 million, and so we're in the process of shifting that across with TEC. It's a bit harder this year because they're different funds and it requires different decision-making at TEC's end, but next year that should be easier. As I say, the mix, if you like, the budget was already showing it anyway. So I think the point I was trying to make, I was thinking about this last night there, is that regardless of the UFS, and maybe regardless of, I don't think we've intervened that much yet. It's happening anyway, if that makes sense. That's where the shift was going anyway. And then of that 48 million, of that 48% next year, so 263 million that's in work-based, it is worth noting that about 11 million of that is the managed apprenticeship delivery that ITPs have done, and there might be questions about that. And another fascinating bit is about 60 million of that WBL provision is actually provider-based. That's what I call, block courses. Not sure what others would call them, but that's where we've traditionally done that on-campus delivery for our ITA colleagues. So there's the point again, I was thinking about this last night, the point again about that is that there's already a lot of interaction or intertwining of our delivery through the UFS. And so one of the questions you had at the start about incentivising, it does incentivise the UFS, it does incentivise work-based delivery, but I don't believe it comes at the cost of, or should come at the cost of, provider-based, because I can see that there's already so much integration between them, and indeed there should and probably will be more. So making the point it's not an us or them or one or the other, it just needs to, it's possibly forcing us to somewhere where we were heading anyway, and we need to figure out, and that's part of the next bit, so how do we get there? That was your other question. Okay, I get all that. What's the plans for creating a portfolio that allows for that? So I'm not going to touch on that, on all of it, because someone said, well, how do you shift your provision to utilise the UFS? And I said, it's kind of like an all of Te Puke response. You need all of those things and more that I've listed there to be going. It's not just about, right, I'll redesign the portfolio, which I can talk to program unification. It's not just about that. It needs all of those other things there to be in harmony and to be moving forward collectively. And I think that's where we are all Te Puking, but I certainly think that's where the transition, the operating model is trying to take us to. So there's, as I say, there's probably lots more of those things here. Industry and employer engagement strategy is absolutely key. And I've been saying this from day one of the UFS. I said, well, if you want to shift more over there, and given and you want us to do more of that, and the definition of work-based is essentially apprenticeship, what does that mean? You need more people signing up apprenticeships. So what's the strategy around that? How are we going to get employers to do that? Unification of programs, I won't touch on it too much, but it is one of the key things that we need to do to, if you like, take advantage of the UFS. We have to have programs that allow learners to, and allow us to deliver those experiences where learners can be in multiple modes or moving through them without necessarily duplicating lots of costs and lots of models. So there's just a few notes there around how we're prioritising unification. I'm in Hamilton the next couple of days looking at, if you like, or working with the team around what the next year looks like in terms of what will be unified when. We will all have thoughts on what we've unified thus far and why we started there or what we should have started with. I've got a strong view that the sooner we get to unifying programs and bringing together teams where we already have models that are like managed apprenticeships and our NZ apprenticeships where we already have models that are like that, the sooner we bring those together and unify that, the better for mine. Not to say that other areas don't need unifying as well. The point about unification is, and I think maybe at the outset, maybe we didn't explain it clearly enough, or our vision for it, that unification was not just about, all right, we'll just get to one program. It was always about, in my mind, sometimes you have to just get to one program. There were pressing needs for that, but it's always about transformation, that through a process of unifying and bringing together all the players there, you would actually transform the program to be what you might want it to be in the future, highly flexed, highly flexible modes, etc. And actually, when you listen to people out in the network say, we need to grow, and the one way we can grow is to have a unified program. And so we need to have a unified program to help us grow so we can spend less time on that side of things and more time on actually engagement and recruitment and then delivery to it. There are many benefits to unification. I'm sure you could probably, if you're involved in it, give me lots of feedback on the things that haven't been as easy. I'm not suggesting it's not really hard work for those there and involved in those unifications, steering groups, working groups, or not yet and waiting for it to come. But there are some criteria there about how we're looking to calibrate what we would do. And quite clearly, I think need to focus on where you get your biggest bang first. And yes, it's maybe those programs that are biggest, but I've also got I think, and most people been around a while will realise this too, that actually one of the ways we can improve our financial performance is by not losing as many learners as we do through attrition, because it's not wasted money, that's probably not the right word, but we all see that struggle of however many, where I'm at EIT, sometimes it's higher than 1 in 4 learners doesn't make it past those early stages, and then we have to chase our tails again to do things. And I think if we can spend more time focusing on, through unification, on transformation, where it makes where a new product's probably not the right word, but a new program can make a significant difference to those learners we're losing, I think we'll be better off. So that's my own personal view and probably a slant on what unification should focus on. Because even though people say it's learner-centred, I say it is learner-centred, but it will also have that financial benefit as well. So there's and there's just a little bit of a slide. So people want to know, okay, when would you be done with unification? This is just current. This is draft. And I know you're probably saying, what programs or suite of programs are in all of that, but you can see it's stepped out over the years ahead. So that, hey, maybe by 2027, which I think we call Horizon 2, we would have the whole suite unified. And then you can sort of see the numbers. So you can kind of see there about 40, it's about that sort of mid-40s for the next few years of those level 1 to 6 programs, and then the degrees down there as well. We have, if I'm honest, been criticised a little bit about you've already unified a third of the portfolio. Well, they were the one-to-one transitions. I was with a colleague at EIT the other day. We have all of the teams involved in unification come together every so often just to share their experiences. Some are, if I'm honest, a little bit tenser than others, and others are really positive about it. And then there was one colleague who was super positive because she was the only one who running the only program in the whole country. So the unification was delightful for her because that's it. So we have been a little bit criticised about that, smoke and mirrors. But it's a reflection that actually there's 342 unique things that we do in the country. So I'm not going to go into that. I can share some of these slides afterwards. But that's it, really. Sorry, how long was that? Bit of a rant.
All right. We've got a few questions.
I bet. Please, let's go.
So, some of them you may have answered, so I'm just going to have a quick read through and then I'll have a quick read through and then I'll fire some at you. So one of the first questions, and it came from Kylie actually. So with the learner component rates, how do we qualify and quantify if learners are within those groups? So how do we qualify what's a disabled learner?
Yep.
And can we apply that to one learner to more than one group?
Yes. So answer to the second part is yes, a learner can be in more than one of those, and we will get the funding for each of those. So if they tick all 4 boxes, you would get that in our calculation, and it's all based on the SDR reporting. So it's all based on the reporting that comes through that you collect up in your enrolments, goes through student management systems, and then goes off to TEC. It's based on that data. There is I think there's a consultation out at the moment, or some advice out at the moment about recording disabilities, because we know that it's underreported. And yeah, so we know that. So we know we're probably underfunded, actually, according to those definitions. Not that I sit there and say, oh, well, we must run around and make sure everyone records it properly so that we can get our funding, but there's more to it than that. So I hope that answers.
You answered my question because I was going to say, we know it's underreported, so how are we going to capture that?
So there is some cross-checking in my colleagues in Learner Journey and Experience have done cross-checking, and we'll try and hold TEC to this, even though it's not their fault if we're not reporting it. Looking at the IDI data, so that's the data that you can get from stats and other sources, and comparing it to our enrolment data, and obviously it proves that there are so many more learners enrolled with us that have recorded or a known disability in another data set or agency. Yeah.
Thank you. Another one from Kylie. Does the 546 million include Adult Literacy Educator Fund and the delivery on the NZQF frameworks at levels 1 and 2?
No, it doesn't. They were 2 separate funds. So if I went back to that slide, I won't, but no, the level 1 and 2 delivery, what we call SAC level 1 and 2, stays the same. So we're about, I think, 25 million. We've hovered around that, and we're still getting the same next year. And the literacy and numeracy funds are the same. I know that there's excess demand up here, isn't there, on one of those funds? But, and actually it's one of the small funds, actually it's refugee English that we're asking for a bit more for next year from TEC, that right across, there's only a few divisions across the country that do it, but we're all, we want more. So no, it doesn't, that's an addition, so that's not impacted. And there's a YG change as well at the moment, a youth guarantee change. If that hasn't been shared out, there's a change in the criteria for youth guarantee. It used to be up to 18. I think it's now been extended to learners up to 24. So there should be an email out in your network somewhere to be shared to say, go through and have a look at that, because it might make a whole lot of more people eligible for it, or give us a whole lot more opportunities.
Now, this question, it's been answered in a couple of different ways, so I'm going to try and summarise it, and apologies if those who have asked the question, I don't quite capture the essence, but there's a couple of providers, a couple of people out there who are asking questions about smaller rural delivery and how that's going to be covered in the new funding system.
So it's a really great question and something quite close to my heart, given my experience from EIT, where that's a strategy we have pursued relentlessly in the face of sometimes the funding system, even as it was set in the face of that. So, something I'm reasonably familiar with. It doesn't address it. There is nothing in the UFS that says, okay, if you're this far from campus or this remote, you will get this much more. There's quite clear there's nothing there. What is there, though, and what TEC would say is, well, we've given you strategic component. If that's something that Te Pūkenga chooses to utilise some of that component for, to support, to grow rural and remote delivery, then that's up to us. And rural and remote delivery is a really common theme that came through when we asked the network about what might be initiatives that you think would be well worth supporting with the strategic component, without saying, the council has to approve it, but that's a really common theme that came through. And so what we'd like to see, I think, in many spaces, and I'll probably wear my EIT hat here, is that others have seen what we've been able to do there and say, and it would have driven us broke eventually, don't get me wrong. How did you do that? How do we take that model where 1 in 3 of our EFTs is not on a campus or online? It's actually out in, and not even in a regional centre. We've got like 6 bricks and mortar regional centres, but out in rural and remote areas on orchards and farms, and this is not work-based, this is using their spaces. Marae is a big one for us. So that's how much we've been able to do, and the cohort size is largely restricted to about 11, because that's as many as you can fit in a van to go and pick up. So how do we do more of that? How do you support the network to do more of that? There's nothing specific there, but that's an area where I think Te Pūkenga would be wise to invest some of that strategic component funding into. Just throwing the money at it doesn't fix it. Does, like, what do you do with the money? You have to come up with strategy, assets, resources, delivery models, staff, etc., etc.
Just going back to the other questions that I asked earlier. So, how will the funding be allocated to the various business units? Many providers are already engaging with work-based learning and apprentices. So how will that work out? Yeah,
so it's one that I spend a lot of time thinking about, and am yet to catch up with our Michelle. Obviously, you guys know Michelle, our CFO, about how does Te Pūkenga budget? At the moment, I can tell you we've just allocated out the funding to each division of Te Pūkenga, largely based on, as I said earlier, on their forecasts and their mix of what they were going to deliver. And thankfully, there's enough money there to do it. It's always more awkward when they're planning on delivering more and there's not enough money there. But that's how we've largely been able to do it. and monitor it at the moment. But is that the way that we should keep doing it? I don't know yet. Are we going to go to some type of regional mixes or something else? Because as long as the allocation of this funding is tied to the enrolment, which it is at the moment, that's the approach at the moment, we trip ourselves up, and I get involved in these conversations as well about how we try to work together, but we trip ourselves up all the time about, but whose EFT is it, or whose learner is it, because we want the funding to flow to my division or my cost centre, etc. People are often, in my experience, in the unification steering committees, we're getting caught up in that. And it stops us from actually freely thinking about the actual delivery models themselves. I don't have the answers to that. As I say, it's a question I think still for Te Pūkenga executive and certainly for Michelle, and I'm sure she'll be keen on hearing from lots of us about what other models might look like. I've got a boss at the moment at EIT who says that's someone else's problem to sort out. I want you to go out and recruit and do the best job you can for those learners that are still in our community and those models, whilst Te Pūkenga and people like me and others will sort out how to flow that budget around. But that's quite a sort of something. It's a nice view of the world, but it also means that we've still got bills to pay as we're still largely operating as divisions. We're not integrated, so we're still got to get the cash into the right places, if that makes sense. I don't know, Jonathan or Martin, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I can't add to what you've said so far.
I think that I know you hate this word, but the kind of internal cross-subsidisation that Te Pūkenga's going to have to do for, I would think, at least 2 years is it's hard enough to do it internally, let alone satisfying TEC that it's all legit. And I was interested in your earlier comments about how they are more likely to make us jump through a few hoops before we can do that. Because, of course, being predominantly a provider-based place here at MIT and Unitec and Northtec, what's happening for us is a sudden, significant drop in funding per SAC with limited time to know how to either pull those funds out or transform the program so that they could be regarded as work-based. So I would hope, and I know that you are, I would hope that on our behalf, Te Pūkenga sort of head office is trying to help TEC understand the time it takes to make that pivot.
Yeah. You put it really well, that whilst we do that, either adjust the operating model or unify, transform the programs to take advantage of it, there has to be a recognition of cross-subsidisation. There has to be, because it just won't work otherwise. But that's what, in my mind, the network is wanting some assurance or confirmation around. I have it right at the moment with colleagues back at EIT saying, I can't run that program, won't survive on that rate. And I'm saying, don't do anything, just run it. That's someone else's problem. It's actually, we're worse off.
It's yours, I think.
It's my problem, right? But where I sit, we'd be worse off if you don't run it, because, then what would those learners do? And so, yes, it might look like some of us are running more stuff than we're used to at lesser margins or even losses than we used to, but we need assurance that actually over here are running it at higher margins, and that's when you put it all together, that's going to be okay. But we need that assurance. At the moment, we don't have it because the hole in the budget, even with that, was too big.
One more question from the audience. What would be the disclosure and confidentiality guidelines under Te Pūkenga in terms of disability and neurodivergence?
It's probably outside of my area of expertise. Is that I need to understand that question a little bit more. Is that about us making declarations on behalf of the learner, or?
Rosario, do you want to jump in? And
Actually, I'll jump in. So that came off the back of the question that Kylie had about disability. And there were a few comments about often disability is discovered well after enrollment. And then just a few comments about
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Not my area of expertise, but yes, well familiar with that. Can we go back and adjust that enrolment record with that learner's consent? They absolutely can. Yeah, if they want to. That would be right, eh? I don't know how much that actually happens.
I don't either.
No, that often I know it happens. We recognise it as we're working with their learner, but I don't know if the loop ever comes back and says, actually, we should put that on your record for next time you engage with it. But again, it has to be with the right conversation with that learner, because. So not aware of guidelines, but that would be something that would be an interesting pickup in an enrolments working group or something, Chris.
Agreed.
Yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. Are there any more questions from anybody in the room?
Lee had a good question in there to get to. It might have been in the chat rather than the Q&A.
Was that the very first question?
It's about the managed apprenticeships being based at providers. It's probably worth touching on.
Yeah, I can just talk about managed apprenticeships. So there's a long history, as everyone will know, to managed apprenticeships, and your experience over here might be different than elsewhere, but TEC obviously put that moratorium on them a while ago. They didn't want to see polytechnics developing more managed apprenticeships. Me with my polytechnic hat on say, well, that's fine, but you go and tell that to the local industry who are not being served by, there isn't an ITO presence out here in Napier or Gizzy. But anyway, that's the history. And then when TEC moved to the UFS, they said, right, you'll stop doing managed apprenticeships because you can just put them all into New Zealand apprenticeships and you'll start reporting them through the industry training register. And I think we started off with, hang on, let's have a conversation with the network about that. And at the outset, it was probably viewed as, oh, they're stopping all managed apprenticeships and that's it. But as probably Di Lithgow from our WBL division, as we moved around the country and engaged with the managed apprenticeship groups, it became quite obvious in my mind that the fundamental assumption that was wrong, possibly at TEC and possibly at Te Pukenga, was that those managed apprenticeships would easily map to New Zealand apprenticeships, that they were very similar products. That they're not. We figured that out pretty quickly. So it's not easy. And that B, they actually serve, and lots of us knew this, they serve a complementary offering to industry, not necessarily a competitive one. In many cases, we found that the managed apprenticeships were there because the New Zealand apprenticeship offered by the ITO was not suitable for that learner. They were after something a bit more, or a bit more provider-based than NZA. And often those conversations were supported by both the ITO, the ITO and the provider. And so we found them to be quite complementary in a way, and that to remove service, which is what we're in the middle of this discussion with TC, and they're viewing it positively, that a move to just say, oh, we'll just use NZAs from now on, not managed apprenticeships, might be perceived, or probably very likely to be perceived by industry and employers as a reduction in service, and that's not something that anyone will want, particularly TEC. So it's that misinterpretation of it. And so we've been saying, actually, we wanted to unify the suite. We want to get those managed apprenticeships teams and the equivalent NZAs together. That would be the obvious place for unification next year, to come up with the best of breed between both. And that whilst we do that, we didn't see a point in taking one step back by saying no more MAs to go one step forward. So we're right in the middle of that conversation with TEC. As I say, it's been viewed pretty positively from their point of view. They've cracked the managed apprenticeship, New Zealand apprenticeship nut through the UFS, because they're funded the same there. And I think they would be satisfied if we sort of didn't refer to them as managed apprenticeships anymore. They'd probably be, and if we sort of just said, well, we've got a full suite of work-based models here, I think they'll view that favourably. So more information to come shortly, but I'm pretty positive about that space. Some would say maybe that's the space we should have started program unification with. I think that might have been a bit trickier a couple of years ago because there are still very different organisations and we're getting there slowly. I hope that's sort of a positive signal around UMAs.
Just one last thing, and I'm picking this up from the chat. There's a little bit of concern about the flexibility being lost with the single funding system.
Yeah, I always share concern around flexibility of a UFS. I have a concern with the UFS that it introduced more complexity, sure, because it sort of just creates another bucket. But often it's, in my mind, it's the way the TEC decide to apply and administer the fund that is the complexity, not necessarily the intent of the fund itself. So I think the intent of the fund is fine, but as I said earlier, if TEC tie us up in knots and say, right, in the UFS, it's you've got to stick to these 5 buckets and you can't move between it, then yes, that would be a risk and a concern. They've assured us that that isn't the case. It's Pukenga would be able to move funding within its within the UFS, or even just allow it to follow the learner and do a wash up at the end. But I also will caveat that to say it's back to the budget conversation earlier. How do we budget for that as well? Because sometimes it's our own administrative things that we put in the place as well that can get in the way. So yeah, it's a concern I'd share, and I guess just say, yep, we hear it, and those of us involved in that are pretty keen to keep TEC honest in that regard.
I think we've gone over time, so
Oh, we have.
yeah. So I'd like to say thank you, Patrick, on behalf of everybody in the room. It's been really enjoyable, and everybody online. Thank you very much. I'd like to call on Zoe to close us, please.
Thank you.
Thank you.